What if the initial words ever written by humanity were not intended as a beginning? What if they represented the final testimony of a world that was already ending, imprinted into damp clay by hands aware that time was slipping away? In the deserts of southern Iraq, where the silence feels heavier than the sand, the remnants of ancient cities continue to hold their secrets. Under fallen walls and vast wind-swept plains lie tens of thousands of clay shards. Each bears wedge-like impressions resembling bird footprints stamped into mud. These impressions are known as cuneiform, and they hold the oldest ongoing records of human ideas we've discovered. But what makes them odd is that they don't seem like origins. Before we proceed, if you like tales where history defies logic, think about subscribing to the channel. And if you're hearing this in the shadow somewhere, leave a comment sharing your location and the time. I want to envision this enigma spanning across time zones as you slip towards slumber. The revelation didn't occur with pomp. It came with dust. During the late 1800s, European archaeologists excavating near the ancient location of Uruk started uncovering mounds of bricks that had hardened under the Iraqi sun for thousands of years. As they pierced the surface, they discovered rooms packed with clay tablets, arranged, indexed, intentionally safeguarded. Countless thousands of them, each the size of a small novel, each etched with detailed writing. When experts eventually deciphered the tongue, they understood they weren't examining the awkward initial efforts of an emerging society mastering script. They were viewing accounts of taxes, remedies for illnesses, celestial notes, agreements in law, songs to deities whose titles had vanished for 4,000 years. They named the authors of these tablets the Sumerians. And from the instant that term appeared in our books, a fracture began in our grasp of history. Because Sumer emerges not slowly, but fully realized. Around 3,500 BCE, in terms that archaeology considers sudden, cities arise throughout southern Mesopotamia, featuring organized layouts, grand structures, sophisticated watering systems, and a numeric framework rooted in 60 that we employ today for timing and measuring angles. Their cuneiform script, in its initial form, includes more than 700 signs. Their religious sites line up exactly with heavenly occurrences. Their commerce routes extend from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. This isn't the typical start for civilizations. History favors gradual advances, with stone implements progressing to bronze, basic dwellings turning into urban centers, simple images evolving into writing systems. But Sumer bypasses the practice. It steps onto the scene already familiar with its role. Experts have devoted more than a century to accounting for this. Some argue we haven't uncovered the prior growth phases, that wear and eras have wiped away the clumsy periods. Others suggest Sumer acquired wisdom from adjacent societies, whose identities are gone to deluge and decay. But the Sumerians provide their own account, inscribed by their own efforts. After kingship came down from heaven, kingship resided in Eridu. This is the revival of what existed prior, not creation. Revival, as though all they constructed was a gesture of recollection. Imagine yourself in a museum storage room late at night, when the corridors resonate with void. You don cotton gloves and raise one of these tablets from its cushioned holder. The clay feels cool, a bit textured. Across its face, hundreds of small wedge indentations reflect the light. Each one intentionally made by a reed tool gripped in a hand that ceased to exist 5,000 years ago. And if you examine certain tablets closely enough, you can still detect them. Fingerprints, thumb impressions embedded in the clay prior to drying. The whorls and ridges of a Sumerian writer frozen like a relic. That individual existed before the pyramids, before the Minoans, before Chinese empires or Mesoamerican structures, and they were noting something they deemed vital enough to endure beyond them. Within those notes are star charts following Venus with precision we didn't match until the telescope era. There are tables for multiplication, instructing pupils on computing compound interest. There are health documents outlining operations and suggesting cures from plants. There are legends explaining how humans were molded from clay, blended with godly substance. Tales that include experimentation, unsuccessful models, modifications across eras, and woven through nearly all they inscribed is a persistent motif. A realm prior to the deluge, when wisdom circulated openly, when leaders endured for unbelievable durations, when those arriving from the skies instructed humanity on charting the stars. It's simple to reject legends as invention, but when identical narratives surface across lands in Akkadian inscriptions, Hebrew writings, Hindu Vedas, and even Mesoamerican books, the recurrence starts to feel less like chance and more like collective recollection borne by those who endured across vast distances. In the 1920s, archaeologist Leonard Woolley was digging into the ancient city of Ur when his crew encountered something unforeseen. A band of pure flood sediment, more than 2 meters thick, laid between clear, living strata. The identical barren clay shows up at Shuruppak, at Kish, at Eridu. All timed to approximately the same era the Sumerians portray in their deluge legends. It wasn't worldwide, but it was devastating enough to reboot society across a whole area. What renders this finding disturbing is what it suggests: that the Sumerians weren't fabricating myths. They were chronicling. Their tablets depict a realm split into before and after, divided by floods and ruin. And all they reconstructed, every urban center, every shrine, every celestial map, was an effort to recover what had vanished. When archaeologists revealed the ziggurat at Uruk, they anticipated basic bases. Instead, they discovered 6 miles of protective barriers, water networks designed with exact calculations, and a religious compound oriented to monitor the winter solstice. Hidden in a fallen library, they found over 40,000 tablets, a collection large enough to chronicle every element of everyday existence, exchange, ceremony, and stellar study. But in none of those tablets do the Sumerians claim to have devised their wisdom. They claim to have obtained it, safeguarded it, revived it from pieces. One expression recurs across shrine engravings and royal offerings etched into rock, intended to endure beyond realms. This is the revival of what existed before. Revival, not origination. As if the Sumerians viewed themselves not as trailblazers, but as excavators of a prior epoch, sifting through the debris of disaster to reclaim what their forebears had comprehended. Within a serene exhibit in Berlin, a modest clay cylinder sits behind glass. Its exterior is inscribed with cuneiform devotion text, detailing the building of a shrine to Inanna, goddess of the evening star. But tucked amid the official words of rule and supplication is that expression once more, the revival of what existed before. And if you press close enough to the glass, so near that your breath mists the pain, you can spot them. The fingerprints of the writer who formed this cylinder 4,500 years ago, imprinted into the damp clay before it solidified eternally. Those whorls and ridges pertain to someone who thought they were rescuing something, not originating it. Rescuing it. Perhaps that's why these tablets still murmur to us over thousands of years. They weren't designed to proclaim a fresh start. They were designed to safeguard the recollection of what preceded, a realm so utterly obliterated by eras and calamity that only shards endured, imprinted into clay by hands that grasped what it signifies to be the final cohort that recalls. At night, when the museum illumination fades and the corridors grow quiet, I envision those tablets respiring in the gloom, each one a capsule of time, each one a dispatch from a folk who understood they were reconstructing atop remnants. We see ourselves as positioned at the forefront of history, advancing into an uncharted tomorrow. But perhaps we're positioned at the distant conclusion of a narrative that commenced far before we mastered recording it. A narrative the Sumerians strove urgently to safeguard before it vanished utterly. And as the breeze shifts over the barren expanses where Eridu and Uruk once rose, bearing dust from societies that ascended and collapsed and ascended anew, you can nearly discern what those ancient writers were attempting to convey. This is not the origin. This is what we succeeded in rescuing. So, let us go back to the clay, to the instant when quiet shattered and the earliest testimony commenced, to the deserts of southern Iraq, where all we believe we comprehend about human beginnings was inscribed once, and then interred for 3,000 years beneath the burden of empires that never realized the Sumerians had preceded them. The clay tablets don't ignite. They've outlasted blazes that devoured the wooden racks they lay upon, floods that toppled the mud brick repositories surrounding them, and the gradual wearing of 5,000 years of gusts. When a structure ignited in ancient Sumer, the warmth didn't ruin their documents. It hardened them further, preserving them like pottery in a furnace. This is how recollection endures, by chance, by disaster, by the very catastrophes intended to obliterate it. In the summer swelter of southern Iraq, where heat surges beyond 120 degrees Fahrenheit, the remnants of Uruk still emerge from the desert ground in fractured geometric forms. Walls that once shielded 80,000 inhabitants. Temple bases that once hosted rituals under skies filled with stars. The sand here shifts endlessly, concealing and exposing, interring and disclosing, and beneath it all, the clay endures. When archaeologists initially started unearthing these locations in the 1870s and 1880s, figures like Hormuzd Rassam, Ernest de Sarzec, and Robert Koldewey. They weren't anticipating writings. They were seeking riches, for sculptures, for precious metals. What they uncovered instead were storerooms crammed with managerial remnants, bills, stock lists, pacts. Tedious, official, unexciting. But when the tablets were scrubbed and organized, when language experts finally unraveled the wedge-shaped marks, the ordinary melted into the remarkable. A lone tablet from Nippur enumerates the provisions given to temple laborers: barley, oil, wool. Below that, another logs a pupil's math assignment, multiplication exercises practicing squares and cube roots. Beside it, a health document recommends cures for ailments using blends of thyme, cedar, and fermented grain. In the same collection, praises to Inanna, directions for forecasting lunar eclipses, a court proceeding concerning contested land limits, and a cultivator's guide advising on watering based on seasonal overflow cycles. This wasn't a society discovering its expression. This was a society already proficient in every form of wisdom. The oldest Sumerian tablets we've located, dated to about 3,500 to 3,200 BCE, hold advanced material from the outset. There are no basic phases, no hesitant trials with symbols. The cuneiform setup emerges whole, able to convey abstract legal ideas, poetic figures, celestial calculations, and managerial intricacy simultaneously. Linguists term this unusual. Writing setups are meant to progress. Egyptian hieroglyphs commenced as basic images and slowly grew more conceptual over centuries. Chinese symbols advanced gradually from oracle bone marks into the intricate framework we identify today. Even our alphabet follows its lineage back through thousands of years of steady change. But Sumerian cuneiform enters the scene completely prepared. And it's not merely the script, it's what the script portrays. Among the tablets from Uruk is a land survey record documenting plot borders, watering ditches, and ownership across the whole city-state. This demands not just reading skills, but geometry, mapping methods, uniform measurement standards, and an administration advanced enough to sustain records over generations. All evident from the initial strata. Meanwhile, tablets from Eridu, regarded as the most ancient Sumerian city, include shrine songs that allude to prior shrines, prior deities, prior ceremonies. The clerics at Eridu didn't assert they were founding something novel. They asserted they were upholding something old. One engraving from the shrine of Enki states, "The house whose base was set in the holy spot, whose ancient plans are conveyed from remote days, not constructed for the first time, not founded here, but conveyed from remote days." Scholars first brushed this off as spiritual verse, the sort of phrasing that lends institutions greater prestige than they truly possess. Temples everywhere assert ancient roots to strengthen their power, but the motif repeats too reliably across Sumerian writings to be simple eloquence. At Lagash, a border marker raised around 2450 BCE details a pact between competing city-states. But before outlining the fresh accord, the engraving declares, "The boundary that was set by the god Ningirsu in ancient times, this boundary is revived again." Revived, not originated. At Nippur, the spiritual hub of Sumer, where writers trained for eras, shrine stock lists enumerate holy items handed down from before recollection. Clay cones interred in shrine bases describe restorations of buildings whose initial constructors are forgotten. The Sumerians reliably depict themselves not as innovators, but as guardians, keepers of wisdom and customs that originated elsewhere, from some earlier period, from individuals whose names had already faded. This modesty would be ordinary if Sumer arose from an obvious predecessor culture. But it doesn't. The Ubaid culture that came before Sumer in the same area displays none of this advancement. Their communities were modest farming hamlets with plain ceramics and fundamental implements. Then, in an archaeological instant, cities materialize between Ubaid and Sumer. There's no steady advance of more intricate villages. There's a break, a void where, according to all models of societal growth, there should be hundreds of years of clumsy shift. Yet, the Sumerians offer no origin legend for their society. They lack myths about uncovering writing or devising mathematics. Instead, their legends describe acquisition, being granted wisdom, being instructed by heavenly entities who descended from the skies, delivering the instruments of society already refined. The Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata includes a peculiar section. Once upon a time, there was no serpent. There was no scorpion, there was no hyena, there was no lion, there was no wild dog, no wolf, there was no fear, no terror. Mankind had no rival. Then the whole universe, the people in unison, to Enlil in one tongue. But then Enki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, the leader of the gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of man that had been one. This section has baffled experts for over a century. It portrays a united humanity using one language, existing without dread in a realm that predated the one the Sumerians occupied. And it casts Enki, the deity of wisdom and fresh water, as the one who altered speech, who introduced variety where unity prevailed. It feels less like origin mythology and more like historical division, a recollection of oneness followed by separation, of completeness followed by dispersal. When you linger with these tablets sufficiently, when you peruse rendering after rendering of shrine songs, ruler lists, legal papers, and star tables, a motif surfaces that's hard to overlook. The Sumerians never assert to be the initial. They assert to be the ones who recalled. In a tablet from the Writing Academy at Nippur, an instructor directs his pupils. From remote days, the scribal craft has been exercised. The utterances of the forebears must be safeguarded, not originated, safeguarded. The clay recalls what we've overlooked, that the individuals who first showed us writing believed they were noting something down, not fabricating something. They believed they were safeguarding, reviving, conveying forward from remote days. They regarded themselves as the heirs of a heritage that came before them, one disrupted by disaster, obscured by eras, but not wholly gone. And if they were correct, if what they imprinted into damp clay wasn't fancy but record, then all we thought we understood about humanity's start might be reversed. Maybe society didn't commence with the Sumerians. Maybe it endured through them. Did the Sumerians document the genuine source of humanity, not as legend, but as recollection? To resolve that, we must face just how improbable their abrupt emergence truly was, and why it shatters every guideline we believed we grasped about how societies arise. In the Nile Delta, archaeologists can follow Egyptian society backward through clear stages like interpreting rings in a tree. First arrives the Naqada III period, around 3200 BCE, with its more ornate burials and early hieroglyphic trials. Before that, Naqada II displays evolving ceramic designs and growing commerce networks. Further back, Naqada I uncovers basic farming communities, and under it all, the Badarian culture, primitive cultivators with fundamental tools and temporary camps. Each stratum builds upon the prior one. Each novelty stems from what preceded. You can trace the path of growth like descending a ladder step by step until you hit the base. The earliest Egyptians mastering farming, settling, organizing. The identical motif persists across the ancient globe. In the Indus Valley, the grand cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro attained their zenith around 2500 BCE with advanced urban design, uniform brick dimensions, and complex drainage setups. But they didn't materialize instantly. Archaeologists have followed their roots through the early Harappan stage back to 3300 BCE, then further to pre-Harappan communities like Mehrgar, a farming hamlet that lasted over 2,000 years, gradually advancing ceramics, metallurgy, and exchange before its offspring constructed the first authentic cities. In China, the Shang dynasty's ornate bronze craft and oracle bone engravings around 1600 BCE cite atop the Erlitou culture, which itself arose from the Longshan culture, which stemmed from the Yangshao culture, extending back to 5000 BCE, stratum upon stratum, century upon century. Each phase laying the foundation for the subsequent. This is how societies are expected to function. Build-up, trial, steady refinement. A group doesn't awaken one day knowing city construction. They acquire through experimentation across eras, committing errors and honing methods until intricacy becomes feasible. And then there's Sumer. When archaeologists dig Sumerian locations, they discover the building equivalent of a finished symphony where practices and sketches should be. The city of Uruk, in its earliest major phase around 3500 BCE, already spans over 250 hectares, about 600 acres. Its protective walls extend nearly 10 kilometers, built with millions of mud bricks demanding extraction, conveyance, uniform creation, and synchronized work involving thousands of laborers. The calculations alone are immense. Erecting walls of that magnitude requires computing volumes, overseeing supply lines, planning crews, nourishing workers, and sustaining the endeavor across years or decades. This degree of coordination usually surfaces after centuries of minor public works, shrines, storehouses, modest defenses. But Uruk's walls exist from the start, as if the city's originators already comprehended exactly how to handle ventures of astonishing scope. Within those walls, the arrangement mirrors deliberate design. Living areas divided from production zones, religious compounds placed at key directions, roads aligned to aid drainage. The Temple of Anu, constructed on a huge elevated base, demonstrates advanced awareness of weight-bearing design. Its foundation demanded calculating load spread to avoid failure, engineering insight that typically demands eras of construction mishaps to gain. Yet there are no collapsed proto-temples below it, no experimental bases, just expertise from the first layer. At Eridu, traditionally seen as the oldest Sumerian settlement, archaeologists anticipated discovering the city's roots in basic shrines that slowly grew into full temples. Instead, even the initial religious building, Temple 17, dated to roughly 5000 BCE in the Ubaid period, reveals architectural skill, a central chamber with an altar, recesses for gifts, and precise alignment. By the time Eridu enters the proper Sumerian era, Temple 3 exhibits such advanced building that it became the model for ziggurats erected 1,000 years later. Where did they acquire it? The Ubaid communities around early Eridu were simple farming villages. None display monumental building. None show the capacity for major public endeavors. Then Eridu materializes, and abruptly there's institutional architecture that would fit in a developed society. Lagash presents the same motif. Its earliest dug layers show a city already involved in intricate watering oversight, with canals requiring mapping, slope computation, and joint labor across various communities. Irrigation appears straightforward until you try it. Misjudge the slope, and water won't move. Dig too far, and you encounter salt that ruins the earth. Neglect coordination with nearby cities, and you ignite water conflicts. The Lagash Canal network functioned from the beginning. No disastrous breakdowns are buried in the dig records. No forsaken channels indicating errors. Just effective water control that supported tens of thousands. Contrast this with early Egyptian irrigation, which needed centuries of trials, channels that filled with silt, basins that didn't fill correctly, seasons where harvests failed due to poor timing. The Egyptians learned via mistakes, adapted, enhanced. Their farming became dependable through practice. Sumerian farming seems dependable from the start. The same holds for their writing. When cuneiform first emerges in the dig record around 3400 to 3200 BCE, it already has about 700 unique symbols. For comparison, the oldest Egyptian hieroglyphs use under 200 symbols and require centuries to grow their lexicon. Early Chinese oracle bone script uses roughly 5,000 characters, but those build over a millennium of growth. You can follow their shift from simple images to complex symbols. Cuneiform's 700 symbols appear at once in tablets from several cities, indicating not sudden creation in multiple spots simultaneously, but spread of an already set system. These aren't images that slowly abstract into signs. From the initial samples, cuneiform merges logograms, signs for words, with phonetic parts, signs for sounds, a mixed system that generally takes centuries to form. Where is the proto-cuneiform? Where are the clumsy transitional tablets where writers are still determining how to express intricate thoughts? They should be there. Every writing system leaves a path of growth remnants, unclear symbols, uneven use, rival systems attempted and dropped. But Sumerian cuneiform appears uniform, as if instructed rather than created. This motif, mature systems surfacing without growth stages, extends across all areas of Sumerian existence. Their legal codes, kept in shards from the earliest times, display advanced ideas, property entitlements, pact enforcement, recompense for harms, succession rules. These aren't basic eye-for-an-eye justice setups. They're subtle legal structures that differentiate between deliberate and unintended injury, that acknowledge various social levels with matching duties, that incorporate appeal mechanisms. Legal systems this intricate usually demand eras of case rulings to evolve, conflicts that expose flaws in current guidelines, boundary cases that compel improvement. Yet Sumerian law appears thorough from its first appearances, as if the creators already grasped the complete range of human dispute. In every society we've examined, refinement arrives late, the earned result of centuries of step-by-step advance. In Sumer, refinement arrives early, already mature. Archaeologists term this the Sumerian enigma. It's not just that Sumer advanced swiftly, it's that it doesn't seem to advance at all. Between 3,500 and 3000 BCE, other areas show hamlets becoming towns. Sumer shows cities materializing with archives already filled. Some experts contend we simply haven't located the prior stages yet. That erosion, flooding, or the moving Euphrates has concealed the steady growth under silt layers. Others propose that Sumer's growth occurred elsewhere, in areas now submerged or interred, and what we dig are already mature outposts. But there's a third option, one the Sumerians themselves indicate, that they acquired refinement rather than cultivated it. That the reason we can't locate Proto-Sumerian society is because Sumerian society is the proto-version, the enduring remnant of something prior. So if Sumer surfaced completely shaped with no growth phases, how did they account for their own roots? The answer is etched in one of the most disputed records ever found. A king list that defies historical logic unless it's something different altogether. In 1906, Hermann Hilprecht was organizing shards at the University of Pennsylvania Museum when he observed something peculiar about a small clay prism from Nippur. It wasn't a bill or a song. It was a catalog, a timed account of every ruler who had governed Sumer, extending back to the dawn of time. He named it the Sumerian King List, and within 10 years it would become one of the most argued documents in archaeology. The prism is small, roughly the height of a large coffee cup, with columns of cuneiform covering all 4 faces. Other duplicates would later emerge, pieces from Larsa, copies from Ur, subsequent Babylonian editions from Nineveh. Each conveys the same tale with slight differences in spelling or sequence, but the core framework stays uniform across centuries and cities. The writing starts with a statement. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Then it catalogues the rulers of Eridu. Alalim, who ruled for 28,800 years. Alalgar, who ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings in total, each governing for durations that exceed human lives by magnitudes. After Eridu come the kings of Bad Tabira, then Larak, then Sippar, then Shurupak. Each city listing leaders whose rules extend into tens of thousands of years. And then suddenly the text shifts. The flood swept over. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Everything alters after that phrase. The post-flood kings govern for decades, perhaps a century or 2 at most, lengths that, while inflated, fit within human feasibility. Etana of Kish rules for 1,500 years, still ridiculous, but nothing like the 43,200-year rule of Enmenlu-Ana of Bad Tabira. Scholars first rejected the pre-flood part as sheer legend, a origin story posed as history, emblematic figures standing for cosmic periods or divine times before human eras properly started. The post-flood kings, conversely, start to match dig evidence. Some later names correspond to rulers whose engravings have been located, whose graves have been dug, whose real existence is separately verified. So the usual reading became myth shifts to legend, which slowly shifts to history. The impossible rules are symbols. The believable rules are recollection. Somewhere amid, fantasy turns to fact. But that reading left issues unanswered. Why would the Sumerians frame clear legend in the same style as trustworthy history? Their legends, tales of Gilgamesh fighting Humbaba, of Inanna going to the underworld, don't claim to be timed accounts. They're obviously story-like, lyrical, emblematic. The king list, conversely, reads like administration. Name, city, rule length, next. No adornment, no excitement, just information. And why do these impossible figures follow such exact patterns? In the 1960s, scholars started noting something odd. The pre-flood rule lengths aren't arbitrary. They're multiples of 3,600, a figure the Sumerians named a sar, one of their main units for gauging huge time spans. Alulim's 28,800 years equals 8 sar. Alalgar's 36,000 years equals 10 sar, and Enmenlu-Ana's 43,200 years, 12 sar. This exactness implies coding. When you see figures that reliably hit mathematical points, you're not reading life stories, you're reading computation. The rules might represent not personal lifespans, but cycles, epochs, stellar periods measured in SAR units. Abruptly, the king list changes from impossible history into feasible chronology. The Sumerians were skilled astronomers. They followed Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn with notable precision. They grasped that heavenly bodies move in foreseeable cycles. Venus finishing its synodic cycle every 584 days, Saturn taking about 30 years to circle the Sun. Over extended watching periods, these cycles form mathematical links, conjunctions, oppositions, patterns that recur. A SAR of 3,600 years approximates certain long-term celestial periods when translated into Sumerian sexagesimal math. Some experts have suggested that the king list's impossible rules encode stellar observations across thousands of years, ongoing star monitoring that would demand either institutional recollection handed down through innumerable generations or acquired wisdom from prior sky observers. Consider what 43,200 years stands for, 12 full SAR cycles. If this encodes something astronomical, perhaps the precession of the equinoxes, which takes roughly 25,920 years to finish a full cycle, or a multiple of planetary alignments, then the king list isn't asserting Enmenlu-Ana lived 43,200 years. It's asserting his epoch matched 12 complete cosmic cycles. The text becomes a timeline, not a biography. This rethinking has deep implications. If the pre-flood section records epochs rather than lifespans, then the king list safeguards a chronological setup that predates Sumerian society. It implies that someone somewhere was following cosmic time long enough to identify these cycles, and that the Sumerians acquired this chronology rather than created it. But here's where the king list becomes genuinely odd. The flood. The document handles the flood as a specific historical occurrence, a point when continuity fractured. Everything before it adheres to one numerical setup, the language of epochs and cosmic cycles. Everything after it adheres to another, the language of human rule, exaggerated but identifiable. After the flood swept over, when kingship was lowered from heaven again. That phrase, lowered from heaven again, mirrors the opening. Kingship descended from heaven the first time to Eridu before the flood. After the disaster, it descends again to Kish. The repetition implies cyclical revival. The world is structured. Catastrophe interrupts it. The world is restructured. What makes this troubling is how it matches geological proof. We know from digs at Shuruppak and Kish that a huge flood did hit Mesopotamia, laying meters-thick silt layers. We know the flood wasn't global, but within Sumerian experience bounds, it might as well have been. Every city they knew, every field they cultivated, submerged under abrupt water. The king list describes precisely this, a dividing event that splits two distinct eras, a before and an after, a realm where kingship followed cosmic rhythms, and a realm where kingship followed human ones. If the pre-flood section encodes astronomical wisdom gathered over thousands of years, and the flood physically ruined the society that gathered it, then the king list becomes a recovery document, an attempt to safeguard chronological recollection across a disaster that erased the people who grasped what the numbers signified. The Sumerians didn't claim to recall what those numbers encoded. They merely copied them loyally, generation after generation, because the document itself was holy, a relic from the realm before the waters. In the quiet exhibits where the king list shards rest behind glass, you can see where later writers made copying mistakes, struck them out, fixed them. They handled the text with respect, as though precision mattered more than understanding. They were safeguarding something they no longer fully grasped, which means the king list might be older than Sumer. In the same way, a cathedral erected in 1200 CE might include foundation stones mined by Romans 8 centuries prior. The structure is medieval, but the bones recall empire. The king list describes a realm before the flood, when rulers governed for impossible durations. But was there truly a flood? In the 1920s, an archaeologist excavating beneath the city of found something that would alter how we interpret these ancient legends forever. In the winter of 1929, Leonard Woolley stood at the base of a trench that had taken his team months to excavate. They were under the royal burial ground at searching for the city's earliest living layers, the first modest communities that would eventually expand into one of Sumer's great hubs. His workers had been retrieving pottery pieces, charcoal from old fires, stone implements, the anticipated remnants of early dwelling. Then suddenly, the artifacts ceased. The diggers hit pure clay, barren, uniform, no sign of human action. Woolley thought they'd reached untouched soil, the natural base beneath the city. He was about to declare the dig finished when he chose, more from diligence than hope, to dig further. 2.5 meters down through that lifeless clay, the artifacts resumed. Pottery, flint tools, charcoal. Beneath the flood layer lay another city, another culture, another world entirely. Something had buried it under 8 feet of water-laid silt. And then, after the waters withdrew, a new society had built directly atop the remains. Woolley called the trench profile a sandwich of history: human dwelling, catastrophic flood, human dwelling. The middle layer wasn't slow buildup from centuries of yearly flooding. It was deposit from a single overpowering event, water moving with such power and volume that it cleansed the landscape, leaving only mud. When Woolley released his findings, he made a claim that sparked headlines worldwide. He had discovered proof of Noah's flood. The biblical link was sensational, but the archaeology was solid. The flood layer at Ur dated to roughly 2,900 to 3,000 BCE, exactly the period when the Sumerian king list describes kingship being lowered from heaven again after the waters swept over. The timing wasn't rough, it was precise. But Ur wasn't the only site. At Shuruppak, the city where the Sumerian flood hero Ziusudra ruled according to legend, excavators found the same barren clay layer about 2 meters thick, separating earlier dwelling from later rebuilding. At Kish, another key Sumerian city, the pattern repeated: artifacts, flood silt, artifacts. At Eridu, where the king list claims kingship first descended, archaeologists uncovered signs of abandonment and reconstruction following a major flooding event. Not every Sumerian site shows this layer. Some cities occupy higher ground that the waters never touched. Others were established after the flood and hold no memory of what preceded. But across the low plains where the Tigris and Euphrates meet, the geological evidence is steady. Around 2,900 BCE, something disastrous occurred. The flood wasn't global. It didn't submerge mountains or drown the whole earth. But within the limits of Mesopotamian experience, within the world the Sumerians knew, it was total. Every field, every village, every city along the river valleys underwater. For people whose entire cosmos consisted of the land between two rivers, the flood was the end of the world, and then it surfaces everywhere. The Hebrew book of Genesis describes Noah constructing an ark to endure waters that cover the earth for 150 days. God alerts him beforehand. He brings animals, family, seeds. After the waters recede, humanity restarts with Noah's offspring. The details vary, but the framework persists: warning, survival, rebuilding. Except Genesis wasn't the first telling. Older than the Hebrew texts by over 1,000 years, the Akkadian epic of Atrahasis describes the exact event with striking similarities. In this version, the gods tire of humanity's clamor and send a flood to erase them. But Enki, the god of wisdom, warns Atrahasis to build a vessel. Atrahasis survives with his family and animals. When the waters subside, he offers sacrifice. And the gods, realizing their error, permit humanity to persist under new terms. The Atrahasis text dates to around 1,800 BCE, but it's copied from older Sumerian sources. The Sumerian version, found in fragments, names the hero Ziusudra and places him as king of Shuruppak, the same city where archaeologists found the 2-meter flood layer. The geography matches the geology, the legend matches the mud. Further north, Ugaritic texts from ancient Syria describe Baal battling Yam, the sea god who threatens to overwhelm the earth with primordial waters. The cosmology differs, but the underlying memory endures. A time when water nearly destroyed everything. Across the Arabian Sea, Hindu scriptures record the Pralaya, a cosmic deluge that concludes each world age. Manu, warned by a divine fish, builds a boat and preserves life's seeds. After the waters recede, he repopulates the earth. The Indian version raises the flood to cosmic need, but the core story remains: warning, survival vessel, rebirth. An ocean away in Mesoamerica, Aztec and Maya texts describe multiple destructions of prior worlds, several by flood. In the Aztec five suns cosmology, the fourth sun ended when the sky rained for 52 years, turning humans into fish. Only one couple survived to repopulate the fifth world, our current era. These cultures had no contact with Mesopotamia. They developed writing independently, millennia apart. Yet they preserve functionally identical stories: a world-ending flood, advance warning from divine sources, a chosen survivor who preserves life, and the rebuilding of civilization afterward. Scholars have long debated how to explain these parallels. Some argue for universal human psychology that floods are common disasters, so every culture naturally generates flood mythology. But the details are too consistent. It's not just there was a flood. It's there was the flood. The one that divided time into before and after. The one that nearly ended humanity. The one that required divine intervention to survive. Random independent invention doesn't produce that level of narrative consistency. Another possibility, these stories preserve genuine memory of regional catastrophes. Mesopotamia had its flood around 2900 BCE. The Indus Valley experienced major flooding. The Mediterranean saw tsunamis from volcanic eruptions. Perhaps each culture documented its own disaster, and the stories later merged and migrated through trade routes. But there's a third option that the archaeology increasingly supports. Something widespread happened at the end of the last ice age, between 12,000 and 10,000 BCE, when massive ice sheets melted and sea levels rose over 100 meters worldwide. Coastal settlements, if they existed, drowned beneath what is now shallow seabed. Entire landscapes transformed, ecosystems collapsed and reformed. If humans witnessed that transformation, if they carried stories of the time before the waters came, those memories might have persisted through oral tradition for thousands of years until writing finally captured them. By then, the original event had fractured into regional variants, adapted to local theologies, but retaining the core. Water came, the old world ended, survivors rebuilt. The Sumerian version might be the oldest written testimony of that memory, the first culture with writing sophisticated enough to document what their ancestors remembered, which means the flood wasn't merely a myth. It was a reset, a moment when continuity shattered, and the world began again. And the Sumer that emerged afterward wasn't inventing civilization. It was restoring it from fragments, rebuilding on top of ruins, both physical and cultural. The geological evidence confirms it. Beneath Sumerian cities lies proof of catastrophe. And on Sumerian tablets lies proof that they knew exactly what had been lost. But if the flood destroyed an earlier civilization, how did any knowledge survive at all? How did the Sumerians possess mathematics, astronomy, and architectural sophistication that should have required centuries to develop? The answer might lie in the one thing water cannot wash away: knowledge deliberately preserved. Knowledge so important that someone made certain it survived the rising waters. If you want to know what hour it is, you look at a clock divided into 60 minutes. If you want to measure an angle, you use a circle divided into 360 degrees. If you want to navigate by the stars, you divide the celestial sphere into coordinates based on multiples of 6. You're using Sumerian mathematics. The base 60 system appears in the earliest Sumerian tablets with no preceding developmental stages. No tablets show scribes experimenting with base 8 or base 12 before settling on 60. No evidence of competing systems tried and abandoned. 60 is simply there, already embedded in everything: weights, measures, time, geometry, astronomy. And it's not arbitrary. 60 has more divisors than any smaller number. It's evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. This makes it extraordinarily practical for trade, construction, and calculation. Dividing a circle into 360 degrees, 60 times 6, creates a system where angles can be subdivided cleanly for surveying and astronomy. Someone chose 60 deliberately, understanding its mathematical elegance. But who and when? The Sumerians themselves don't claim to have invented it. In their educational texts, clay tablets used to train scribes in the Aduba schools, the standard phrase appears repeatedly: "From distant days, the scribal art has been practiced." Not, "We developed this art," not, "Our teachers created this system," but "from distant days," a passive construction that places the origin outside living memory. Among the school exercises found at Nippur are multiplication tables extending into the thousands, division problems using fractions, calculations for compound interest, and geometric formulas for calculating the areas of irregular fields. These aren't rudimentary lessons, they're advanced mathematics taught to children, which means the adults already possessed knowledge far beyond basic arithmetic. One tablet, designated YBC7289 and housed at Yale, shows a square with its diagonals marked. Next to the diagonal is a numerical approximation of the square root of 2, calculated to 6 decimal places: 1.414.213. This level of precision requires understanding irrational numbers, a concept that supposedly wasn't formalized until the Greeks 2,000 years later. Yet there it is, scratched into clay by a Sumerian student copying from an older exemplar. The same pattern appears in their medical knowledge. The earliest Sumerian pharmacological texts, collections of remedies and treatments, don't read like early experiments in healing. They read like reference manuals compiled from established practice. A tablet from Nippur dated to around 2100 BCE contains over a dozen prescriptions using combinations of plants, minerals, and animal products. Time for respiratory infections, willow bark, containing salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, for pain. Fermented grain mixtures for digestive ailments. The text specifies dosages, preparation methods, and expected outcomes with clinical precision. These remedies work. Modern pharmacology has confirmed that many Sumerian medicines contain biologically active compounds effective for their stated purposes. This knowledge doesn't emerge overnight. It requires generations of careful observation: which plants help, which harm, in what combinations, at what doses. Yet the Sumerian medical corpus appears fully formed in its earliest attestations, as if documenting a tradition that was already ancient. Their metallurgy shows the same sophistication. By 3000 BCE, Sumerian smiths were producing bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that requires precise temperature control and ratio management. Too much tin and the metal becomes brittle. Too little, and it doesn't harden properly. The optimal ratio is roughly 88% copper to 12% tin. Sumerian bronze consistently hits this ratio. No phase of trial and error castings is preserved in the archaeological record. The earliest bronze artifacts show professional quality metalwork, tools with proper temper, weapons with effective edges, decorative objects with sophisticated craftsmanship. This implies either that the Sumerians learned metallurgy from someone else, or that their learning phase happened so early it left no trace, which raises the question of who taught them or when they had time to teach themselves. Their legal codes suggest similar inheritance. The earliest Sumerian law collections, fragments predating Hammurabi's famous code by centuries, contain complex jurisprudence, laws distinguishing between premeditated and accidental harm, statutes governing property disputes and inheritance rights, regulations for commercial contracts, and debt management. Legal systems this nuanced typically evolve through case law, real disputes revealing gaps that subsequent legislation addresses. But Sumerian law appears comprehensive immediately, as if the framers already anticipated the full spectrum of human conflict. And then there's their astronomy. The Enuma Anu Enlil tablets, named after the Babylonian king, who commissioned their copying around 1650 BCE, record observations of Venus over a 21-year period. These aren't mythological descriptions, they're data logs. In month X, day Y, Venus appeared in the east. In month Z, day W, Venus disappeared in the west. The observations are accurate to within a single day across the full cycle. This precision requires continuous monitoring across generations, sky watchers tracking Venus every night, recording its positions, recognizing patterns. Venus doesn't cooperate with casual observation. Its synodic period, the time between identical configurations as seen from Earth, is roughly 584 days, meaning a complete cycle of patterns takes years to document fully. The Enuma Anu Enlil tablets preserve data that required institutional commitment spanning decades, possibly centuries, and they're copies of older Sumerian originals, meaning the observational tradition extends even further back. Meanwhile, the ziggurats, those massive stepped pyramids dominating Sumerian cities, weren't purely religious monuments. They were astronomically aligned. The ziggurat at Ur, reconstructed around 2100 BCE but built on older foundations, aligns its corners to the cardinal directions with less than 1 degree of error. Its stairways face the summer solstice sunrise. Achieving this precision requires understanding the relationship between celestial motion and terrestrial orientation, knowledge of the ecliptic, the celestial equator, and the annual movement of the sun relative to the horizon. It requires instruments for measuring angles and patience for tracking solar positions across seasons. The Sumerians had both. They compiled constellation lists, catalogs of star groupings used for timekeeping and agricultural planning. Some constellations they named are still recognized today: the bull, the lion, the scorpion. These weren't arbitrary patterns. They marked celestial coordinates that helped farmers know when to plant and sailors know which direction to travel. They tracked lunar eclipses, recording them systematically enough to recognize the Saros cycle, the roughly 18-year period after which eclipse patterns repeat. This knowledge requires continuous observation across multiple generations, with records preserved and compared to identify the pattern. All of this, the mathematics, the medicine, the metallurgy, the law, the astronomy, appears in Sumerian civilization without the developmental scaffolding that should precede it. Where are the centuries of failed bronze alloys? Where are the generations of miscalculated eclipse predictions? Where are the early legal codes that don't yet distinguish between accident and intent? They should exist. Knowledge this sophisticated should leave archaeological traces of its development: false starts, dead ends, gradual refinement. But those traces are missing. which returns us to the phrase that whispers through so many Sumerian texts: knowledge was given, not discovered, not invented, given. The tablets describe a time before the flood when wisdom flowed freely, when divine teachers walked among humans, when the mysteries of the cosmos were revealed rather than puzzled out. We've treated this as mythology, as primitive people attributing their own achievements to gods because they couldn't imagine human ingenuity as sufficient. But what if it's documentation? What if given simply means inherited, passed down from teachers whose names were forgotten from a time before a catastrophe erased continuity? The flood layer at Ur is 2.5 meters thick. Beneath it lies an older civilization with its own pottery styles, its own tool traditions, its own lost knowledge. What if some of that knowledge survived, carried by refugees who fled to higher ground, preserved by oral tradition until writing could capture it, encoded in practices whose origins no one remembered but everyone maintained? The Sumerians might not have invented their sophistication. They might have inherited it, fragmentary and incomplete, from people who lived before the waters came, which raises the question that defines everything else. Who were those people? Who passed the knowledge on? The answer might lie not in what the Sumerians knew, but in how they spoke, in the language itself, which appears in history as mysteriously as the knowledge it was used to record. Languages evolve the way rivers carve valleys, gradually, visibly, leaving traces of every stage along the way. Latin transforms into Italian, Spanish, French, and Romanian over centuries of phonetic drift and grammatical simplification. We can track these changes through inscriptions, documents, and regional dialects. The process is messy, inconsistent, filled with hybrid forms and transitional stages. A Roman from 100 CE would struggle to understand a Parisian speaking French in 1000 CE, but a linguist can bridge that gap by following the breadcrumbs of change. English descends from Old English, which evolved from Proto-Germanic, which emerged from Proto-Indo-European, a language we've reconstructed by comparing its descendants across Europe and Asia. We can trace that lineage back roughly 6,000 years by identifying shared vocabulary, similar grammar, and phonetic patterns that persist across daughter languages. Chinese characters have been used for over 3,000 years, but we can watch their evolution, from pictographic oracle bone scratches to stylized bronze inscriptions, to the standardized forms used today. Every stage is documented, every transition preserved. This is how languages work. They come from somewhere. They carry ancestry in their bones. Even when a language dies, it leaves linguistic DNA in the languages that replace it. Loan words, grammatical quirks, phonetic fossils that betray their origins. And then there's Sumerian. Sumerian appears in written form around 3300 BCE with no precursor, no parent language, no family tree. Linguists call it an isolate, a language with no known living or dead relatives anywhere on Earth. It stands alone, as if it fell from the sky fully formed. This shouldn't be possible. Languages aren't spontaneous creations. They develop from earlier tongues through slow mutation. Even when populations migrate and encounter new environments, their language carries evidence of where they came from. Vocabulary borrowed from neighbors, grammar influenced by contact, sounds shaped by the languages spoken around them. But Sumerian shows none of this. Its structure bears no resemblance to the Semitic languages that surrounded it. Languages like Akkadian, Assyrian, and Babylonian, which would eventually dominate Mesopotamia. Semitic languages use root systems built from three consonant cores. KTB in Arabic gives words related to writing. Sumerian doesn't work like this at all. Instead, Sumerian is agglutinative. It builds complex meanings by stringing together smaller morphemes like beads on a chain, prefixes, suffixes, and infixes attached to root words, modifying meaning and grammatical function. A single Sumerian word can contain what English would express in an entire sentence. Take the word Lugal, king. Add suffixes and it becomes Lugal-e, by the king, ergative case. Lugal-ak, of the king, genitive. Lugal-ra, to the king, dative. This kind of system resembles languages like Turkish, Finnish, or Japanese more than anything spoken in ancient Mesopotamia. But Turkish, Finnish, and Japanese all have linguistic relatives. We can trace their histories, identify their language families, connect them to earlier forms. Sumerian connects to nothing. Linguists have spent over a century searching for relatives. They've compared Sumerian to Uralic languages, to Dravidian languages in India, to Caucasian languages in Georgia and Armenia. Every hypothesis hits dead ends. The vocabulary doesn't match. The grammar diverges. The phonetic patterns refuse to align. Some researchers proposed that Sumerian might be related to ancient Elamite, spoken in what is now southwestern Iran. Both were neighbors. Both existed in the same era. But when scholars analyze the grammar and vocabulary in detail, even that connection dissolved. Sumerian and Elamite are fundamentally different languages that simply happen to coexist geographically. The only explanation linguists have settled on is that Sumerian represents the last survivor of a language family that went extinct, a linguistic lineage whose other branches disappeared without trace, leaving Sumerian isolated in time. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If Sumerians' relatives vanished, when did they vanish? And why is there no archaeological evidence of the people who spoke those related languages, unless those people lived before the flood? The timing aligns disturbingly well. Sumerian appears in writing around 3300 BCE. The flood layers at Ur, Shuruppak, and Kish date to roughly 2900 BCE. If Sumerian was already being spoken before the catastrophe, if it was the language of the cities buried beneath the flood silt, then its isolation makes sense. The disaster that deposited 2.5 meters of sterile clay also erased the linguistic context that would have made Sumerian comprehensible. We'd be looking at the last surviving dialect of a drowned language family. What makes this possibility more intriguing is how Sumerian grammar behaves. Linguists have noted peculiarities that suggest substrate influence, traces of an older language affecting Sumerian structure. Some grammatical features don't fit cleanly into agglutinative patterns. Certain word orders seem borrowed. Specific phonetic quirks appear inconsistent with the rest of the language. It's as if Sumerian itself is a hybrid, a language that absorbed elements from an earlier tongue, preserving fossilized structures whose origins are now lost. Languages do this when speakers of two different languages intermarry, or when a dominant culture imposes its speech on a conquered population. The resulting hybrid carries ghosts of both parents. If Sumerian shows substrate influence, what was the substrate? What earlier language left its fingerprints in Sumerian grammar? We'll never know because whatever it was, it's gone. What we do know is that Sumerian didn't die easily. Even after Akkadian, a Semitic language brought by new populations, became the dominant spoken language of Mesopotamia around 2500 BCE, Sumerian persisted. Scribes continued learning it in schools. Priests continued using it in temples. For over 1,000 years, Sumerian and Akkadian coexisted, Akkadian for daily life, Sumerian for scholarship and ritual. By 2000 BCE, Sumerian had stopped being anyone's native language. No children learned it at home, yet it remained essential. Babylonian kings commissioned Sumerian inscriptions to legitimize their rule. Scholars copied Sumerian texts to preserve ancient wisdom. Temples maintained Sumerian liturgies because the gods, they believed, preferred the old tongue. Sumerian became what Latin would become to medieval Europe, a sacred language, the key to older knowledge, the speech of ancestors who understood truths modernity had forgotten. Babylonian scribes created bilingual dictionaries, painstakingly translating Sumerian texts into Akkadian so the knowledge wouldn't be lost. They treated Sumerian with reverence, as though its words held power that transcended mere communication. One scribe, copying a Sumerian hymn around 1800 BCE, added a note in Akkadian. The ancient words must not be altered. They contain the wisdom before the great change. What great change? The flood? The transition from Sumerian to Akkadian dominance? Something older still? The Babylonians themselves didn't know. They simply understood that Sumerian mattered, that preserving it meant preserving access to something essential. Even as their own language evolved and their empire expanded, they kept Sumerian alive in schools, libraries, and temples for another 2,000 years. The last cuneiform tablet ever written, dated to 75 CE during the Roman Empire, contains Sumerian phrases. By then, Sumerian had been dead as a living language for over 2,000 years. Yet someone, somewhere in Mesopotamia, still thought it worth writing down. What were they trying to preserve? Perhaps Sumerian wasn't just a language. Perhaps it was a time capsule, the last linguistic remnant of a world that existed before the waters came, before a catastrophe fractured continuity, before the people who spoke related languages disappeared beneath the flood silt that Leonard Woolley would excavate 4,000 years later. If Sumerian is a fossil, then the language itself becomes evidence, proof that something existed before Sumer, something sophisticated enough to develop complex grammar, something organized enough to require written communication, something that vanished so completely that only echoes survive in a tongue no one understands the origins of. Is Sumerian a fossil of a pre-flood language? The answer might lie not in grammar or vocabulary, but in what the Sumerians used that grammar and vocabulary to describe. Stories that sound less like imagination and more like testimony, myths that read less like poetry and more like memory, translated into the only form that could survive catastrophe. Most creation myths begin with God speaking worlds into existence, a word, a breath, a command, and reality obeys. The Hindu Rig Veda describes creation emerging from cosmic sound. The Hebrew Genesis has God saying, "Let there be light," and light complies. These are stories of divine will manifesting instantly, perfectly, without struggle. Sumerian creation myths don't work like that. They describe problems, mistakes, iterations, adjustments made across multiple attempts before anything functional emerges. If these texts are myths, they're unusually honest about failure, and if they're metaphors, they're remarkably specific about process. The Atrahasis epic, composed around 1800 BCE from older Sumerian sources, opens not with humanity, but with divine labor disputes. The younger gods, the Igigi, are exhausted from maintaining the world. They dig irrigation channels, dredge rivers, build temples. After 3,600 years, one Sar cycle, they revolt. They burn their tools, march on the assembly of elder gods, and demand relief. The elder gods convene. They need workers, but they can't force divine beings to labor eternally. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, proposes a solution. Let a birth goddess create offspring. Let man assume the drudgery of the gods. But creating humans isn't instantaneous. It requires experimentation. The goddess Nintu, also called Belet Ili, Lady of the Gods, collaborates with Enki to fashion the first prototype. They take clay from the Apsu, the primordial freshwater abyss beneath the earth. They mix it with the blood of Weilu, a slain god whose essence or ghost provides something the clay alone cannot. The text is explicit about ingredients: clay, physical matter; divine blood, animating essence; the womb of the birth goddess, the vessel where mixing occurs. Then Nintu begins the process. She pinches off clay. She mixes it with the divine essence. She shapes forms. And then she makes 7 beings, but they're defective. The Enki and Ninmah text, a separate creation account preserved on tablets from Nippur, describes this phase in uncomfortable detail. Ninmah creates the first human, but something goes wrong. The being cannot hold back urine. Enki assigns it a role anyway, a servant who needs no control. She creates another. This one cannot close its mouth, cannot speak clearly. Enki gives it a job as a musician, no speech required. A third has poor eyesight. Enki assigns tasks that don't need vision. A fourth has paralyzed hands. Again, Enki finds a function. The text continues through multiple flawed prototypes, beings with physical and cognitive defects, each one given specialized roles based on their limitations. It reads less like divine poetry and more like a clinical record. Attempt, defect, adaptation, next attempt. This is quality control documentation. Eventually, the process stabilizes. Nintu and Enki refine their technique. They produce functional humans capable of reproduction, labor, and maintenance of civilization. The text describes 14 birth goddesses, 7 creating males, 7 creating females, establishing reproductive populations rather than a single breeding pair. The language throughout is procedural. The gods don't wave hands and speak humans into existence. They mix, shape, test, adjust, and iterate. There's craftsmanship here, not miracle. Engineering, not magic. What makes this even stranger is the purpose. Humans aren't created for companionship,